Once you're in escrow, the idea that it's basically done is how deals fall apart, because the only thing more expensive than bad marketing or a bad offer is a bad escrow. So how do you avoid a bad escrow, or one that falls apart and puts you back on the market? By knowing and understanding the 8 checkpoints of an escrow that actually move a pending sale to a closed transaction in East Bay cities like Oakland, Berkeley, El Cerrito, and more. What I found is that 8 checkpoints drive every escrow, and at half of them, a deal can completely blow up if they're mishandled. I'll walk you through all 8 and spotlight those 4 escrow killer spots, plus how to diffuse each one. I've been in the business for a long time and I've seen a lot of transactions. Watching one fall apart because of the mishandling of one of these checkpoints absolutely sucks. So I've spent a lot of time with my team establishing systems to prevent that from happening. But what's interesting is the most dangerous checkpoint isn't the one most sellers worry about. By the way, I'm Derek Tyler with the Lateral team at Red Oak Realty. I'm a former attorney and 13-year top producing East Bay agent.
Wow.
We've helped hundreds of sellers prep, price, and produce incredible sales results. In part 2, you learned how to set a list price and when to adjust it, how to handle the entire offer process, and how to strategically respond to offers to get the highest price and best terms for your home. In part 3, you'll learn how my clients and I treat escrow as an active phase, not just a victory lap. I'll outline your role as the seller at each checkpoint and show you the communication that keeps everyone engaged, lenders moving, and how to answer buyer requests without derailing the deal. We'll also tackle what a low appraisal really means for deposits and next steps. This is part 3 of my 3-part home seller guide series. One really important thing that I want you, the viewer, to know here is that the timelines for contingencies and escrows vary deal by deal. Many of the timeframes are assigned by the buyer's lender, like days to close, appraisal contingencies, and loan contingencies, and other timelines. So by the time you've made it to the escrow, those timeframes have already been negotiated and agreed upon. Your primary job during an escrow is to respond quickly, facilitate what's needed to move the process along, provide necessary information to your agent and the title and escrow company, negotiate fairly, and when necessary, hold people to the agreed clocks when you must. And as promised earlier, I'll call out each time we hit one of those 4 deal killers so you'll know exactly where to lean in. Part 1, the deposit. The first and generally most critical checkpoint after an offer is accepted is that the deposit comes in. It's typically due within 3 business days, but you may have negotiated that it come in sooner. When there's a delay here, it could be a sign of a problem or that the buyer got cold feet and wants to back out before they deliver the funds that they would be at risk of losing if they were to back out after they came in. I tend to act quickly here for my clients so that if that's the case, we can put the property back on the market quickly and not lose an open house weekend to buyer tomfoolery. If you have a backup offer, it's good to get to them ASAP as well before they find another property and get into contract on it. This is the first of the 4 escrow killers. Treat a wobbly deposit as a decision point, not a wait and see. Checkpoint 2, inspections. If a buyer has an inspection contingency, they need to begin scheduling and completing their inspections after the deposit comes in. Sometimes sellers will ask me if they can be present at the inspections. While the answer is technically yes, here in the East Bay, it's pretty unusual for the seller to be there during the buyer's home or pest inspection. Usually those are events where the buyer's agent, the buyer, and inspector get some privacy to go over the house and speak and discuss freely. On some occasions, I've attended on behalf of my seller. The most common situation where I attend an inspection is when the property is tenant occupied. Usually I'm present for all tenant occupied showings when I'm the listing agent to try to make sure a tenant's unit is handled with care and nothing is disturbed. And if something happens, I can work on addressing it and letting the sellers and tenants know before they come home and discover something wrong themselves. When there's a specialty inspection, like a foundation inspection with an engineer, and the seller has specific knowledge about what work has been done to that foundation, that's where it might make sense for you as the seller to attend a buyer inspection. But please, 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 don't show up unannounced. A buyer pushing for additional investigative access after removing or waiving their inspection contingency is a bit of a red flag. Many buyers do want to come back to measure for furniture, show the house to their parents, or get bids on things they plan on doing after closing. Inspections themselves aren't the killer. It's how you handle the outcomes. So what happens if the buyers finish their inspections and want to renegotiate? This checkpoint is the second potential escrow killer. Here's the approach I use with sellers. If a buyer during their inspection period discovers an undisclosed issue that affects health or safety to which we didn't know the cost until they provided us with the bid, and they request a price reduction or credit towards their closing costs to address it, then I lean towards giving some on this. This is why I recommend a full disclosure packet that includes a home inspection, a pest inspection, and estimates for any health and safety issues discovered during those inspections. Having this and providing it to buyers before they write offers generally leads to few of these types of discoveries, or even better, a buyer that waives their inspection contingency altogether. For any issues a buyer claims they discovered that were previously disclosed in our disclosure packet, I'm usually on board with, at the very least, some seller pushback, especially when those issues aren't health and safety, are extremely common, or had a repair estimate already disclosed too. Where it can get interesting is when a seller discloses an issue but does not disclose or include a cost or estimate to repair the issue. Where I see this most often is with pest inspection reports, oddly enough. This is where a pest inspector may find a massive amount of dry rot to a porch or a deck. A pest inspector, when they give an estimate for repairs, is legally required to make repair recommendations that remove all of the fungus, termite, or dry rot damage. For a deck, that might mean completely tearing it down and rebuilding it. That can be a $20,000 job for a deck that may not look like it needs that amount of work. Often in this instance, sellers ask the inspector to refer that particular item to a contractor instead of giving their own company's estimate or bid. Where sellers make huge mistakes is not getting an estimate or bid from a general contractor to make likely less expensive repairs to that hypothetical deck. Then, during a buyer's inspection, they either get their own pest inspection or their own contractor to bid the repairs and make a credit or price reduction request in that amount. You could argue that the buyer was advised of the issue and should have taken the likely cost into consideration when they made their offer, but on the other hand, they could only really know the exact repair cost by getting their own bid because you didn't provide one in your disclosure packet. These are situations where there can be some give on the seller side, and it's usually an amount greater than what it would have cost you to get an estimate yourself before you put the property on the market. In the event you're presented with a buyer bid that seems unreasonably high, you can get a third-party assessment or competing bid and shape your counterproposal based on that. The lesson here is to do everything you can before escrow to avoid negotiations over condition during escrow. If you have to negotiate here, the ultimate goal is to right size, credit win smart, and keep momentum. Checkpoint number 4, the appraisal. While most appraisals are fine, when they're not, our strategy and approach keeps you moving. An appraisal is a buyer-lender requested independent third-party investigation of the property to verify a few things. 1, that the property is what everyone thinks it is. 2, that there are no significant health and safety issues. And 3, that the property is reasonably worth the contract price. It's also one of the 3 biggest potential escrow killers I mentioned above. Before I get into why, I want to explain how the appraisal works. Shortly after escrow begins, the buyer's lender makes a request through an appraisal management company that sends out an appraiser. They show up to see if the property is actually there. Sometimes it's not. They measure it to make sure it's around the same size as advertised, because sometimes it's not. And they take a look at some basic health and safety issues like whether smoke and carbon monoxide detectors are in the right places and that the water heater is properly braced and strapped. For FHA appraisals, there are a few more things they'll look into. After that, they're generally making sure the house isn't falling apart or uninhabitable. Let's be honest, they're there sent by the lender to make sure that the house won't kill the person that's paying back the loan. Either before they come or after they've visited the property, the appraiser runs their own comps to see if the contract price makes sense in the current market. Herein lies the issue. Most properties come in at value. However, an appraisal below the contract price can trigger a negotiation if there's an appraisal contingency. If the gap is too big, a buyer might simply just walk away. If there's no appraisal contingency, yes, the buyer's deposit can be at risk in theory if they decide to back out. But in practice, collecting a deposit often means lawyers, time, and money you may never recover. Despite being a former attorney myself, my strategy is influence, not litigation. I avoid appraisal shortfalls by providing comps, comparative sales, anchored to the property's market value, and any competition during the bidding process. A one-pager of property updates with dates and costs, and I ensure that the water heater is braced and double-strapped and that smoke and carbon monoxide detectors are installed to avoid easy fails. And most importantly, when we make a decision as to which offer we go with and choose to accept, way before we get to this point in escrow, we select an offer at a price point we think should reasonably appraise. If it still comes in short, we push for the buyer to make up the shortfall, and if that fails, evaluate whether a price reduction preserves the timelines and net better than going to a backup offer, going back to the market, or a legal fight over the deposit. If we're 4 to 5 business days after escrow day 1 and no one has called me to schedule the appraisal, I check in to see why one hasn't been scheduled yet. Checkpoint-ish number 5, keeping the calendar honest. I run a steady communication rhythm, updates at key milestones for you, while staying on top of the buyer, their lender, and title and escrow process, and progress. But what happens if things fall behind? We have a form called a notice to perform. A notice to perform is essentially a formal notice that says to the buyer, you have 2 days to remove X contingency, or we can unilaterally cancel on you. While these usually don't get sent out until a buyer is late on removing a contingency, they can technically be delivered up to 2 days prior to a contingency removal due date. The delivery date of one of these notices is day 0. The next day is day 1, and the contingency removal due date would become day 2. If the buyer doesn't remove their contingency by 11:59 p.m. on day 2, then 12 a.m. day 3 is the soonest you as the seller can unilaterally cancel on the buyer. Keep in mind, in this scenario, the buyer generally gets their deposit returned. This changes the calculus of sending these and actually executing a cancellation. If you really need to know whether you're moving forward with or moving on from a buyer, then you can put pressure on the situation and be aggressive with these notice to performs by sending them just a couple of days before the contingency is due to be removed. Many times a phone call and communication addresses whatever the real issue is here, but if these communications aren't satisfactory, you can utilize the notice to perform to push a buyer who's behind to move forward, cancel, or communicate what's delaying them. Also keep in mind that once the 2 days have passed, it doesn't mean that a cancellation is automatic. It just means that you can send the cancellation and you can send that at any time. So who or what is that fourth and most dangerous escrow killer? Well, you and your patience, along with the buyer's adherence to the timelines you and they agreed to. Unfortunately, there are many aspects of an escrow you as a seller don't have any control over. You don't control a lender's clock. You control your expectations, your documentation, how you respond, and when to use pressure that actually produces action. But use it wisely. Don't blow up a deal just because you're impatient. Even if you have a backup buyer chomping at the bit, they're still going to take time to close and come with their own uncertainties as well. Speaking of don't and don'ts, make sure you don't miss my last don't at the end of this video. I've got one more bonus escrow killer in there where if you make that mistake, it's like blowing a tire right at the finish line. Checkpoint 6, local point of sale items to expect. Thus far, we've run a parallel track to the buyer side of the escrow with deposits, inspections, and appraisals, with a strong eye on the seller side. If you haven't watched my video covering the buyer side of escrow, you can click the link above. Here's where we're going to depart quite a bit and discuss some things that were not discussed in that video. One of the first is local point of sale ordinances. The terms and responsibilities were already laid out in your contract, but some of how that gets handled occurs during escrow, and if mishandled, it can grind escrow to a halt. First, private sewer lateral compliance is required in many East Bay cities. Before we hit the market, we confirm whether yours is already in compliance or will need to be brought into compliance in the future. If your property is out of compliance, we would have obtained an assessment and estimate that we include in our disclosure packet. With the buyer's offer, they would have indicated if they were taking on the responsibility of bringing it into compliance or requesting that you, the seller, bring it into compliance. A buyer can be surprised by the $4,500 deposit East Bay MUD requests when deferring compliance till after escrow, so keep an eye out for this. However, the document they signed taking on this responsibility did give them notice. If we're in a situation where the seller is bringing the property into compliance, we try to schedule this work early enough ahead of time so the work date would take place on a date we estimate would be before closing, but after the buyer's contingencies are removed. Either way, we plan it before you list so it's not a day 15 surprise. Second, Oakland specifically has a sidewalk ordinance that requires the sidewalk, abutting or adjacent to a home, be brought into compliance prior to the close of escrow. This responsibility can also be passed on to the buyer to take on and bring into compliance after the close of escrow too. It functions almost identically to the sewer lateral ordinance in that it can be passed on to a buyer and there's usually an inspection and bid included in a seller disclosure packet. However, the issue that I most commonly see, ironically, arises from it not being an issue at all, that a property has no sidewalk abutting the property. This is pretty common in Montclair, Redwood Heights, and other neighborhoods in the Oakland Hills. Even if you don't have a sidewalk, you still have to get an exemption certificate for that. This requires going onto the city's website and submitting an application for one. It's simple enough that sellers should be doing this themselves, but I find my buyers having to do this during escrow instead more often than not. Third is Berkeley's Building Emissions Saving Ordinance, BESO for short. There have been recent changes to this ordinance that require more action in terms of actually performing emissions reducing work. Berkeley is such a competitive market that it's likely compliance will be taken on by a buyer in a competitive situation, but there's always a chance that after removal of all of buyer's contingencies, but before close, you as the seller might be installing, say, a new electric water heater to comply with this new ordinance. I plan to make a full video on all of this. It will be linked above once it's out. The fourth point of sale ordinance regards automatic gas shutoff valves where required. An automatic gas shutoff valve goes onto your gas meter. It's actually a cool device. It's like a rectangular box with another box on top with a ball bearing inside. Upon an earthquake or some sort of violent shaking or lateral movement, it will shake that ball till it drops down into that lower rectangular box to block off the gas supply, thus being an automatic gas shutoff for earthquake events. The city of Alameda requires installation for residential sales, and unincorporated Contra Costa requires them for property transfers. Other areas like Berkeley and other parts of Contra Costa County only require them upon significant renovations. This requirement is new for Alameda as of January 1, 2026. Like the other ordinances above, this too can be passed on to the buyer, but there's the possibility that you may need to install one before the close of escrow. Oh, and the reason why you want to do it after the buyer has removed contingencies, but before close, if agreed upon in the offer, is that you generally don't want to do work and spend money for a sale until you know the sale is likely to go through. You only know with a large amount of certainty that the transaction will close after the buyer has removed all their outs, allowing them to retain their deposit. Those outs are their contingencies. On the topic of certainty, I host weekly 20-minute office hours for homeowners looking for a level of certainty when it comes to making decisions about selling, renting, or investing. The booking link is below, just a short intake form so I know who I'm talking to and who to call. Bring your thoughts, questions, and ideas. If texting is easier, text the word hours3 to 833-335-1469 and I'll send the Calendly link. Let's get back to it. Checkpoint 7. Who pays what? Every contract is different, but here is the usual orientation so you're not surprised late in escrow. Your purchase agreement obviously controls. Sellers commonly cover 100% of the county transfer tax, and customarily 50% of any city transfer tax. They cover payoffs of all loans secured by the property, including interest to pay off and reconveyance fees, the natural hazards disclosure report, recording charges to clear title, prorated property taxes owed up until the transfer date, unpaid HOA dues, if any, notary fees, and any bonds or assessments due and payable. On the screen, I have a redacted estimated seller closing statement that you can check out. Feel free to pause to read through it. Buyers commonly cover title insurance premiums, escrow fees, recording charges for buyer documents, loan costs and prepaid interest, property tax proration from their acquisition date, HOA transfer fees if applicable, and any assumption or change of records fees. While some sellers may feel the whoa after seeing their half of the city transfer tax, where a seller can really feel surprised is when final loan payoff totals differ from their expectations. I was recently on the other side of this, where a seller's final loan payoff didn't line up with their expectations, and it would have meant that they'd have to bring cash to escrow to close the transaction. It was a tight one. Luckily, it was more of a clerical error, but it delayed our closing by a week. If you've already had a difficult escrow, you never know if one more delay will be someone's breaking point. I try to avoid this scenario by putting together net sheets much earlier on in our process and making sure there's room before we get to that final point. If we know it'll be tight, I advise that we stay on top of the amounts owed the entire time to make sure there are no last-minute issues or delays. Checkpoint 8, closing. Here's how we land it cleanly. Title and escrow will typically ask you for a statement of information, loan payoff information and authorization, HOA contacts, and any HOA documents you have, a valid ID for signing, and your wire instructions to send your proceeds. Do not be surprised by follow-up requests. For signing, a mobile notary is often the simple and fastest choice. However, in-office is fine too. We coordinate timing so it fits between the buyer's closing disclosure clock and recording. Recording is the close. Keys usually transfer at recording unless we negotiated a rent back. Let me know if you want to see a video on rent backs in the comments below. Sale proceeds usually arrive into your bank account the next business day after recording by wire, or you can pick up a check. Quick note, keep insurance and utilities active until the sale has recorded. Now to our don'ts. Here are the simple don'ts that keep momentum. Don't mini exhale until deposits post. No deposit means no real signal of intent. Don't show up to the buyer's inspections unannounced. Coordinate access and keep it professional. Don't overuse or overplay notices to perform. Send them to produce action when you must, not just to posture. And my last don't, and that bonus escrow killer I mentioned above, is don't unnecessarily create new disclosures during escrow. Delivering new disclosures can give the buyer a 2-day right to cancel while keeping their deposit. This hands them leverage to renegotiate if they want to. If you truly discover something new that must be disclosed, of course, disclose it. What you don't want to do is start re-remembering or looking into things that should have been in your disclosure packet in the first place way later in the game. Try to schedule all your re-remembers to occur while we're working on the disclosure packet. So quick recap. Part 3 was all about escrow and the 8 seller checkpoints and 4 escrow killers to be on the lookout for and how to handle them. If you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for notification of when new videos drop on the channel. If you're thinking about making some real estate moves in 2026 and want to talk them over with someone who knows a thing or two about real estate moves, you can click the top link in the description to schedule a call or text hours3 to 833-335-1469 and I'll send my Calendly link right to you. If someone you know is in need of some clarity or direction on the escrow process, please share this video with them. If you missed any part of the series, you can click part 1 or 2 here or here. If you want a full breakdown of what's going on in the market, click here for my most recent East Bay market update.